Good evening to everybody. Welcome to another Wednesday night where we're going to be looking at our Bible study in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Last Wednesday we finished the book of Ezra, and we saw how the altar was rebuilt, the temple itself was rebuilt, worship was reestablished. They took care of some issues that they had with some of the people intermarrying with the other religions of the world, and we saw a lot of things take place in the book of Ezra. Well, now Nehemiah is going to start today, and that's what we're going to be looking at for the next another 5, 6, 7 weeks, something like that. And we'll be looking at each of these over the next several weeks. Chapters, we'll be looking at each one and what deals with building a new wall around Jerusalem. You see, now that the remnant is back in Jerusalem and they are worshiping at the temple and they're doing what God has called them to do, they need to have that protection so that other nations of the world can't come in and destroy them and wipe them away. So they're going to need to rebuild those walls, rebuild their protection, their gates, and that's what the book of Nehemiah is all about, is rebuilding those walls and those protections. So let's get started on that this evening. We're going to be tonight in Nehemiah chapters 1 and chapter number 2. So I hope that you will follow along with me. We got some neat things to look at tonight, some interesting things that I hope that you will enjoy. The report from Jerusalem is how we're going to begin this chapter, verses 1 through 3. I don't do this very often, but since it's just short 3 verses, let me take the time to read those verses with you, okay? Starting in verse number 1, it says, "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah, and it came to pass in the mouth of Chislu in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan the palace, that Hanai, I'm not very good at these names, can you tell? One of my brethren came, and he and certain men of Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews that had escaped, which were left of the captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant that are left of the captivity there in the province are in great affliction and approach, and the wall of Jerusalem also is broken down, and the gates thereof are burned with fire." So we've got a very dire situation going on in Jerusalem. Even though the temple has been reestablished and worship has started again, they're not in a very good situation. And so let's start looking at some of these here. Number 1 is the report from Jerusalem. And Nehemiah is going to receive this report in the 9th month of the 20th year of Artaxerxes. Now, this is important to remember, this whole 9th month 20th year idea, okay? Because it's going to become important in chapter number 2. We're going to look at some detail on that here in just a few moments, okay? So Nehemiah is receiving this report during the 9th month in the 20th year of Artaxerxes. Nehemiah asks how things are going in Jerusalem, and the report was not particularly good. He didn't get a good report back. The remnant that was in Jerusalem had been in great affliction, great reproach. There was people trying to destroy them, and so for this reason, Nehemiah gets upset, and he gets upset about the reason that they are not able to defend themselves, that they're not able to help themselves, and he's going to show that sad countenance to King Artaxerxes here in just a few moments, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. We'll look at it in just a moment. The reason for this, the reason that they were in great affliction and reproach, was because they had no way to defend themselves. There was no way for them to really defend the city. There was no way for them to defend the temple. The walls had been broken down. They had been busted down after the Babylonians came in and completely destroyed the city several years earlier underneath Nebuchadnezzar. And so it just wasn't able to defend itself. And the walls of Jerusalem had become broken down all the way around. So not only were the walls broken down, but the gates of the city were burning with fire. And we're going to read a little bit more about that here in just a few moments. Now, as we get into the second point of chapter number 1, verses 4 through 11 are dealing with Nehemiah's prayer. And Nehemiah is going to give a really interesting prayer for us to look at here. And I'm not going to take the time to read all of that at this time. That's something that you can read on your own, verses 4 through 11. But we are going to look at Nehemiah's prayer and what it was all about. And there's some interesting things that happen here. First of all, underneath Nehemiah's prayer, when Nehemiah heard these things, he was very upset. He was distraught. The Bible says that he sat down, he wept, he mourned, he fasted, and he prayed. And so he was very torn about this, that yes, the people of Israel, the Jews, were able to go back, and they praised God for that, but now they were being burdened. They were being beaten up. They were being beaten down. And this made Nehemiah very sad, rightfully so. So he sits down, weeps, mourns, fasts, and prays. And as he's sitting there praying, God impresses upon his heart, Nehemiah, you need to get up and go to Jerusalem, rebuild my walls. And so God's placing this call on Nehemiah's life. He's being called to go and do this job. And so he begins his prayer with humility. Nehemiah goes to God. He says, Lord, I have sinned. And here's the other awesome thing. I made this point last week with Ezra. I'm going to make it again this week with Nehemiah. I love this. Even though they were not part of that sin, because they were part of the Jewish people, because they were part of the tribe of Judah, because they were part of that remnant, they included themselves in the mess. And so just like Ezra said us and our and we, guess what Nehemiah does? Nehemiah does the exact same thing. Verse number 6 shows us his heart. He says, we have sinned. And so he admits that the Jewish people had dealt corruptly against God, that they had done God very wrong, and they were sorry for that. Also, they had not been keeping God's commandments, God's statutes, God's judgments. They hadn't been keeping the Passover meal, which they were supposed to keep every single day, every single year. They were supposed to keep the Feast of Passover. And so there were things that they were supposed to be doing that they were not doing. And Nehemiah basically got down in humility, asking for mercy, asking for forgiveness, and saying, God, we're sorry that we've not been doing this the way that you've told us to. Nehemiah now recalls a passage from Deuteronomy that God gave to Moses. Deuteronomy chapter number 28, verses number 64 tells us almost the exact same thing, that if Israel sins, they will be scattered. But here's the rest of that verse in Deuteronomy, and here's the rest of what Nehemiah presents to God. It's almost like Nehemiah saying, God, you remember saying this? You remember giving this to Moses? You remember giving this to the children of Israel so many years ago? I'm reminding you of it. And it is, if we sin, which we have, we would be scattered, and we have been scattered. But if we seek forgiveness, we will be gathered back together. And so Nehemiah is kind of trying to remind God of that. Of course, God didn't need to be reminded of it. God's the one that spoke it. God knew what he had spoken to Moses many, many years before. But Nehemiah is just reciting it, maybe even for his own benefit, that if they would seek God, that God would forgive them and heal their land and bring them back together. So Nehemiah seeks the mercy of God. On his behalf, he's looking for mercy for himself, but then he's also looking for mercy on behalf of the entire nation of Israel. So Nehemiah calls out to God in prayer here in chapter number 1, verses 4 through 11. That already brings us to the end of chapter number 1. Chapter number 2's got some really interesting things as well. Before we get into chapter number 2, I want to recall your attention for a moment back up here to the very beginning of chapter number 1. Remember, I highlighted this a moment ago for you on your screen. In the 9th month of the 20th year of Artaxerxes. And I said, remember that time frame because we're going to recount it again in chapter number 2. So let's get chapter number 2 brought up now, and let's look at a couple of the interesting things that we have in Nehemiah chapter number 2. As we begin Nehemiah chapter number 2, verses 1 through 8, again, I would encourage you to read them on your own, but for time's sake, we're going to look at the outline here together. As you look at this outline, we see that Nehemiah is sent to Judah. Verses 1 through 8 of chapter 2 is Nehemiah leaving Babylon, leaving the king's court, and going to Judah for himself. And verse number 1 makes for a very interesting study, which ties into those few words that I was highlighting for you in chapter number 1. Because verse number 1 says something very interesting. Remember, in chapter 1, we read about all of that taking place in the 9th month of the 20th year, right? Well, now as we open up chapter number 2, we open up and we read about the first month of the 20th year. And as we get to the first month of the 20th year, it makes us kind of a little bit confused. We're like, well, what's going on here? Is this a mistake? Is this a flashback? What's being recorded here? The first chapter says the 9th month of the 20th year. The second chapter says the first month of the 20th year. There's something wrong, right? No, there's actually nothing wrong at all. We've just got to study it a little bit, and it makes for an interesting discussion. here's what's interesting about it, okay? Nehemiah is giving us the Jewish months. Chapter number 1 is in the 9th month of the Jewish calendar. Chapter number 2 is in the 1st month of the Jewish calendar. But Artaxerxes does not go by the Jewish calendar. And so the 20th year of Artaxerxes could have fallen anywhere on the Jewish calendar, and that's just so happened to be what it was. The 9th month in the Jewish calendar and the 1st month in the next year for the Jews all fell in Artaxerxes' 20th year. Okay, so this helps harmonize everything, helps us harmonize chapter 1, helps us harmonize chapter number 2. It's not a mistake, it's not a flashback. We're just talking about a 4-month period. And while the Jews have turned over a new year, we've now gone to the 1st month of a new year for the Jews. Artaxerxes is still in the same year. So they're just using a different time. They're using a different calendar. And so it doesn't line up perfectly with one another. But we can help make it make sense. And I think that makes perfect sense, at least to me. I hope it does to you as well. So Nehemiah is giving us the Jewish months. Artaxerxes does not go by the Jewish months. He goes by his own months. He's the king. He can declare whatever year he wants. And so it was the 20th year of Artaxerxes. We have the 9th month for the Jews and the 1st month of the Jews, both happening in the same year. All right. So to the Jew, a new year had dawned, but this was still the 20th year of the king. And now we can see that there was a 3 to 4 month period of time between chapter number 1 and chapter number 2. Nehemiah, one of the very last points there in verse number 8 tells us that Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. Actually, we can find that at the very end of chapter number 1. We can find that point. And again, there in verse number 8 of chapter 2, that Nehemiah is the king's cupbearer. And as he goes to the king, apparently he's always in a good mood. But this day, he was not in such a good mood. And we're going to see a little bit more about that here in just a second. All right. So that is Nehemiah chapter number 2, verses 1 through 8. Let's look at the second half of the chapter today and learn a little bit more. Oh, we've still got a couple of more points to go. I apologize. We're not quite there yet. Still got a couple of more things in verses 1 through 8. All right. So Nehemiah being sent to Judah, we see that he is the king's cupbearer. He's apparently always in a good mood. However, when the king sees Nehemiah this time, Nehemiah is in kind of a sad mood. And so the king asks Nehemiah, what is wrong? And Nehemiah tells the king all that is going on in Jerusalem, about the walls being destroyed, about the oppression of his people, about the gates being on fire. And so Nehemiah kind of tells the king everything that's happening. And the king asks, well, how can I help you? So the king's willing to help him and work with this a little bit and try to figure out what's going on. Nehemiah then asks permission to visit and see the walls for himself. He says, let me just go down there, give me the papers, give me the authority to go down there, look around, see what's happening, and see what's going on. And then also, in the very next verse, I think this is verse number 7 or verse number 8, we see that he specifically asked for timber to begin the construction process. King, give me papers to go and get timber out of the king's forest and to be able to rebuild the gates and rebuild the walls and rebuild the things that need to be done. And the king grants all of this. The king says, okay, go, you're allowed to go. So that brings us to verse number 8. All right, now let's look at the second half of chapter number 2, which is verses 9 through 20, okay? Nehemiah is now going out and he's going to inspect the walls, and there's some interesting things that take place here. Passing on to Jerusalem, Nehemiah ran into a couple of people that were not happy that Jerusalem was being checked out, that Jerusalem was being looked at again. They weren't very happy about it, but nonetheless, that's exactly what was happening. So when Nehemiah arrives in Jerusalem, he couldn't go out during the day to inspect the walls. It was too dangerous. People could see him. The opponents could see him. And so Nehemiah wasn't going to do that. He was going to do it at night. So he goes out at night by himself, and he starts examining the walls, see how the walls were, what was going on, what was going to need to be done. He first came to the dung port, which is also known as the dung gate, and that is on the south side of the city, and the dung gate was on fire. Now, I don't want to paint too crude of a picture, but just follow along with me here for a moment. This means exactly what it sounds like, all right? This was at the south side of the city. Not only is it the south side, but it's also at the bottom of a mountain. Remember, Jerusalem sits at the top of Mount Moriah. And so as the city goes south, it also goes down into the Kidron Valley and the Valley of Hinnom. And so as it goes down into those valleys, everything flows down. And that's exactly what happened without trying to be too crude, but to be honest with you, that's where all the sewage of the city went. So if you can imagine all the sewage running down, going to that dung port, that dung gate, running out of the city, and Nehemiah says that it was on fire. And so you can imagine the absolutely awful smell that must have been there. Moving northeast, he's kind of coming around the gate, wanting to go northeast to view more of the walls. The walls were so badly damaged, the Bible actually says that his own animal could not make the trip. I don't remember now off the top of my head whether it was a horse or a donkey or what it was, but he couldn't get around it. The damage was so bad, he could not continue. So he kind of had to double back, and he went from the southeast side of the walls over to the southwest side of the walls and started going north up the mountain and north. And so as he goes, since he couldn't go around the dung gate, which was on the southeast side, he starts going around the northeast side, and he comes all the way to the fountain gate and notices the walls on that side are very badly damaged as well. This is... I said that wrong. I apologize. Let me back up a little bit. As he came around the dung gate, he was going towards the fountain gate, which was on the northeast side, okay? But he couldn't get to the fountain gate because the walls were so damaged. So he had to double back, and that's when he came around to the valley gate, which is on the northwest side of the city. I apologize for the confusion there. But on the northwest side, he comes to the valley gate. He's able to make it there, and that's where he comes back into the city. Nehemiah finally tells the people about what the plans are. He tells them exactly what is going on, and he's going to try and get some support. So he tells them how the king had given him not only permission, but also the timber to complete the job that was at hand. So Nehemiah had everything that was needed to do the job. The people get excited about the job. They're strengthened in their spirit. They're strengthened physically. They're ready to get started on the job. But wouldn't you know, like normal, the Jewish people can never have it easy. Something always happens. Something always takes place, and that's exactly in this case as well. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem tried their best to intimidate the people of Israel, tried their best to intimidate the Jewish people, Nehemiah himself, and to stop the work. But Nehemiah told them very simply, he said, God will prosper us. And so that brings us to the end of chapter number 20, where Nehemiah is saying, no, we don't care what you say. We're going to get busy. We're going to do what God has told us to do. So an awesome start to the book of Nehemiah. Next week, we'll actually be able to get in. We'll be able to see some of the walls being rebuilt. We'll start learning some of the details about how they did it, what they were doing. Was it just one or two people, or was it a whole lot of people? We'll look at all of that next week, starting in chapter number 3. So next week, be prepared for Nehemiah chapters 3 and 4. I'm looking forward to it. Hope to see you back here at the same time next Wednesday night. If you are able and you would like to, we'd love for you to join us Sunday morning as well. Not only will we be streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, but we're also meeting in person. We'd love to have you here. Come to the house of the Lord and worship with us. So I hope to see you then. God bless you. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon. Bye.